So today we're looking at the nature, features and language of poetry. And in this introduction, I want to present a little opportunity to reflect on what poetry does and how and why it works. So one of the reasons for the appeal of poetry is the ways in which poetry captures feelings and imagination of the whole person. I could inform you of historical events around the death of Abraham Lincoln. He was the 16th president of the United States, and he was shot in 1865, and he was attending a play at the time. Or I could read you a poem. "O Captain, my Captain, our fearful trip is done. The ship has weathered every rack. The prize we've sought has won." This is similar to Matthew's poem. "The port is near, the bells I hear, the people all exulting, while follow eyes the steady keel, the vessel grim and daring. But oh heart, heart, oh the bleeding drops of red, where on the deck my captain lies, fallen cold and dead. My captain does not answer, his lips are pale and still. My father does not feel my arm, he has no pulse or will." So this is a poem by Walt Whitman, and it illustrates the nature of poetry. Let's just ask people in the class, but what are some of the reasons why poetry works? And apparently that's also about the death of Abraham Lincoln, but it's not mentioning his name. But thoughts on why poetry works?
Instead of just being able to write and go for it, it gives rhythm and it gives a way of maybe remembering things. I guess it makes things easier to remember, and it enables people to be a little more abstract with their ideas.
Yeah, great word. Love it. Abstract with ideas. Yeah, love it.
Because to really connect both the head and heart, to kind of adapt and use a lot more narrative emotion in just either within the most of the line and such, visual techniques. Also with how the connection between poetry and song is very close in that way. The melody, the language, very beautiful.
Yeah, love that. That's great. Yeah, thoughts? And then we'll ask after the next two students, Matthew, Jade and Kayla. Yeah, your thoughts?
Like the time is really cold and not a lot of not like contemporary or like songs bring about a lot of emotion.
Yeah, so a statement can be cold without much comfort, but a poem has emotion. And yeah, thoughts? In a very different way, isn't it? It's using this emotive language, and that's one of the reasons it's so effective, is because it's unfamiliar to us in some ways. Matthew, your thoughts as to why poems work?
I've heard it said that it's like the highest form of art. So just its beauty, and being able to convey a message or meaning.
Yes, and imagine
through
if
beauty.
I was to walk up to a lady of my dreams and share some biological, there are some hormones moving through my bloodstream, drawing me in your proximity. Would you like to go out sometime or something? That may not convince them as more poetic language. I love you, your beauty feels like my thoughts or something. And so poetic language touches something very deep inside the person as to the identity of the person. And so I think you convey that well, Matthew. It's the highest form of art and communication. Jade, your thoughts as to why poetry works?
Yeah, it speaks emotively, and I think, it helps us feel understood. Different emotions if someone was to say, how are you feeling today? You could say, oh, I'm feeling happy or sad, you know, but that's always such an umbrella statement that never justify, like, you know, it never fully gives the answer. But poetry like explores it in depth, you know, it can talk about things in a creative way that you couldn't really say otherwise in another form of speech.
Very good. It's got this other form of speech there. And Kayla, your thoughts on why poetry works?
I think instead of, someone saying I'm feeling XYZ emotion, with poetry, you hear that emotion and you hear the feeling through, I guess, the tone or the words that they're using. So I think it has that ability to resonate or to be personal, to allow the person hearing or reading it to sort of share in, I guess, whether it's excitement or like empathy but share in those feelings as if they're feeling them themselves, not just hearing about someone else's whatever emotion is in the poem.
Yeah, excellent. That is so true and good. So we see that in poetry, we have this capacity to look very deeply into the nature of what it means to be a person, a human, and to be able to communicate that with others. Notice the poetry is often personal in that you're digging into the depths of your own thoughts and emotions, and then you're communicating that to others. Notice that it often is holistic in that it connects the head and the heart. Notice that poetry can help us to feel understood, and certainly many people find poetry of therapeutic value. So if you ever feel there are real struggles and difficulties in life, then I encourage you, write a poem or write a song, get out a guitar, because poetry can really have therapeutic value. And even though you pour out these poetic outpourings for yourself, you can also share them with others. And then if the Psalms have 150 poems that pour out the heart in a song, we could go to them and interact with them, and then they could really help us as well. So we had an opportunity before, and Matthew, what were 2 or 3 things you were seeking to communicate in the poem of Psalm 23 that you wrote? I sink afloat, dreaming, snoozing, wide awake, a million miles from everywhere. The needle pointing freely northbound, immutable. What are some of the thoughts you're wanting to communicate in this poetic reflection that begins with some ideas from Psalm 23, Matthew?
I just tried to capture, mainly it was based on the Lord. He sets a table in the presence of my enemies. And it's just the peace in the chaos. And so I've sort of set that within a nautical setting. There's some allusions there to Greek mythology with Odysseus, Charybdis and Scylla. They submit to the sound of the great silence of being God, who is the helmsman at the ship. And just the paradox there, it's at the beginning, that first line, very much it is a paradox, the sink afloat, dreaming, snoozing, wide awake. It's kind of, this is the paradox in the sense of whilst the chaos is going around, we can still have the peace of God in our life. So that's sort of all in a nutshell.
And thoughts on the therapeutic value of writing this or reading it? What's the therapeutic value of a poem like this that has these contrasts in it, Matthew?
Yeah, well, it's, I felt, I was really surprised with what came out. And to be honest, because obviously a lot of the studies and things that I'm doing, this is not something I would have written 12 months ago.
Yes.
So yeah, there's been a development in my understanding of literature and an appreciation that is being formed. But it also helps me connect with the psalm in a greater capacity. So I'm actually able to begin to transfer those ideas from what David is feeling into my sort of presence self, within an artistic context. So there's lots going on there. So very therapeutic, especially in today's climate, what's going on with everything.
Yeah, and I love that idea that it reaches deep into the recesses of our mind. And so there are thoughts and feelings we might have. And what's very healthy therapeutically is to bring these out into the open. And so I think that was very effective there, as you brought some thoughts out into the open. And often there are happy thoughts, but there are also tensions. And you've brought both of those out in the poem that you've presented us there, Matthew. So thank you very much for that. That's very, very helpful. And then if we were to go to others, here's another example from Denisha. So just a second. Yep. Any thoughts? What can you tell us?
Well, it's about like God's faithfulness.
Yep. Yeah, so good. So Psalm 48, God's faithfulness, and then you've got the Son beautifully made, and we're humbled by his grace. So that's really very, very good. So thanks, Denisha. That's excellent. And then we've got here Kayla. What can you tell us, Kayla, about your poem based on Psalm 16?
So I actually wrote this probably a year ago, a bit over a year ago, in a bit of a season of loss and letting go. And I think when you look at Psalm 16, there is a real sense of depending on God and confidence in God. And I think that is something that you can hold to in all seasons, regardless of what they look like. So I think for me in writing this, it was really about, I guess, acknowledging that there are times where there are seasons of grief and reconciling that can be a reality that you feel, but at the same time knowing that God is good and that he has you. And so there's sort of those two very different emotions of trusting God and hoping in God and knowing that he's good, but at the same time going, but I'm feeling all of these feelings of grief or sadness or whatever it is. And I think just sort of having that parallel of, there are times where you feel different things, but through all of those seasons, you have hope and trust in God.
Yeah, brilliant, brilliant. And so thank you for each one sharing those. And I think the authenticity that is shared as you share something from the heart and the depth, I think is very effective. And that's very effective in also in the work you do in the future. Can I give you another example? And how many people have never heard, bye bye Miss American Pie, drove my Chevy to the levee, but the levee was dry. Then good old boys drinking whiskey and rye. This will be the day that I die. Has anyone never heard that song? So that song, interestingly, is partly about the death of Buddy Holly, 3rd of February 1959, and Don McLean's Mourning the death of a great singer. However, the poem's going further. Because it's February 1959, it's the end of the decade. So the 1950s are coming to an end, and Don McLean's reflecting on that. And so as good as American as apple pie is coming to an end, because the 1960s and 70s is coming and the Vietnam War, and then as American as a Miss American Beauty Queen is coming to an end. So the song laments the passing of an age of happiness and innocence and faith. Also, will the time of people going to churches come to an end? Did you write the book of love? Do you have faith in God above? If the Bible tells you so, how do you now? Do you believe in rock and roll? Can music save your mortal soul? And can you teach me how to dance real slow? So there's some very deep thoughts there that Don McLean has picked up. And then we could look at Starry, Starry Night as another one about Vincent. or we could look at A Candle in the Wind, which was originally Marilyn Monroe and her death, and then became Lady Diana and her death. So each song, I think, is dealing with deep things. So we could also look to the Bible. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. And one of the interesting things there is that God is probably not dressed in shepherd's clothes, and we are probably not covered in wool. So literally it's not true, but figuratively it's powerful that God shepherds us. And that's the strength and the limitations of a metaphor. So he leads me beside still water. So there's that sense of peace that Matthew was describing before. Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I will feel no evil. So C.S. Lewis said poets are always telling us about how the grass is green, the thunder loud. And this is most remarkable of the powers of poetic language to convey the quality of experiences. So if you want to look at poetry further, C.S. Lewis has written on poetry and theology and the power of poetry. If you go to the YouTube by the Bible Project on the art of biblical poetry, you'll see there that there's some resources to watch through. So if you type in Bible poetry and the art of Bible poetry, you'll see there that poetry is very powerful. In Exodus 14, we've got the description of going into the land. And then in Exodus 15, there's a poem that declares what it's like to go into the land, which is full of emotion. And it describes a wall of surging water and divine nostrils blowing, which is very intense. So there's an intense experience there. And so poetry communicates this intensity of experience. Now, often there's two lines in a poem, a Hebrew poem. So the first line makes a basic statement, and the second line develops this statement and it deepens it with different words or images. And so if you go to Psalm 51, be gracious to me, O God, according to your loyal love, is the first statement about God's graciousness and love. And then it develops this thought and it can say, according to your great compassion, blot out my transgression. So it develops further, if you love me, what about when I do wrong and I need your help? Wash me thoroughly from my iniquity, purify me from my sin. So washing is a metaphor like baptism, and then purifying is what can happen within us. And then I know my transgressions, my sin is ever before me. So it repeats the thought in Hebrew poetry, and then it develops the idea that we have sin before us. There can be contrasts. I know my transgression, my sin is before me, and there can also be many facets, like the different aspects that you are looking at around the one key idea. And these experiences can bring transformation and change. So poems really are using structures to look at a particular concern or issue from different angles. So I encourage you to have a look at that Bible Project YouTube on the art of biblical poetry, in which they point out that 30% or more of the Bible is made up of poetry, because the Bible's setting out to move us. So poetry is also found in many sections of the Bible, like Exodus that we looked at. Exodus 14, the Israelites go through into the sea on dry ground, and the Egyptians flee after them. But Exodus 15, in the greatness of your majesty, you overthrew your adversaries. You sent out your fury, it consumed them like stubble. What I like about reading this is that I can apply this to my life. And so there can be many difficulties that I face in my life. And as I read Exodus 15, I can feel, yeah, God's on my side despite the difficulties. Because I write what I think are brilliant assignments and hand them into lecturers, and they come back with red marks and critique on them. And I'm quite surprised by this mystery of life. See, I could write a poem about that and overcome my distress. Alternatively, I could do some more work on it. Would be another approach as well. So there are a number of reasons why poetry is particularly effective. One is they use fewer words. And we've said right at the beginning, fraught with background or lack of background in Hebrew writing. There's a lack of background to this. And so it's the lack of words in poetry that stirs the imagination, isn't it? So if I was to tell my good wife, you know, I love you like a rose unfolding or something like that, rather than saying, you know, I love you, I make a breakfast, coffee and things like that. That doesn't work quite so well as poetic language. And so poetic language, it's what you leave out sometimes that makes it effective. Fewer words that encourages the reader to fill in the gaps. I mean, how is a rose connected with love? Well-chosen metaphors capture deep emotions, imaginations, and insights, and the metaphors connect a deep idea, experience, or emotion with the object or image. So the metaphors explore the deep recesses of every area of our life and our subconscious, even those that we cover up. Now notice poetry shares this with prophecy, which we'll look at next week. And you might be interested to start to think about prophecy or to look at prophecy in some of your assignments. It considers deep fears, and judgment is a deep fear in prophecy. It considers high hopes, deliverance in prophecy. So prophecy could be said to be a particular type of poetry. Poetry is often personal. Poetry often uses surprising metaphors that stretch our imagination. In terms of poetry being personal, it often expresses his or her thoughts or feelings. We have an insight, and often we don't know that we have these insights buried deep within us. Matthew shared before about how they come out from the deep recesses. Poems are like sharing on personal experiences. Now, I think this may contrast with prophecy, which is more communal, reflect on communal sins and judgments and communal hopes that we share together. A number of you have mentioned repetition and rhythm, and we find this in song as well. It's this repetition and rhythm, this beat that helps us to become meditatively moved to another space where what's buried in our deep subconscious can come out. So you might want to explore that further. Neuroscientists have looked at the way in which the brain responds in poetry, and it can get into the deep recesses of the mind. Now, Pentecostals would say that speaking in tongues can get them there as well, but other traditions, non-Pentecostal, would say in the Quaker tradition, you sit silent, and it's silence that gets you there. You find it's the rhythm of a song, it's the music of a song that draws you in and captures different things that are going on in your mind. So these rhythms are very helpful, and parallelisms are very helpful. And we'll look more at parallelisms in the next session. Contrasting words and images that evoke contrasting truths are very useful. So I think all of these are wanting to get into the imagination and the subconscious, into the emotional, into the area of feelings and the way that connects with the embodied person. There's associations between ideas, elaborating on themes and related ideas. So poetry is open-ended. That is, it presents us with emotions and insights, but it doesn't fill in all the answers for us. It opens us up. And that's why it's useful in worship. It opens us up to the presence of God and the word of God to us. Next week, we could do a similar exercise. If you've not done the poetic one, you might want to do that for week 5. I'll encourage you, if you want to try a prophetic word next week. That is, what does it mean to write down, I sense God is saying, and to be open to God, what are you saying? And I was thinking about this before. I was thinking perhaps one could bring a prophetic word about God is wanting to work with us like a tree that's cut back, and then it'll bloom again and grow out again. So that's really being open to God, revealing something into our mind and our thoughts, or open to our mind developing these ideas. Edgar Allan Poe says poetry is the rhythmic creation of beauty. The rhythm of Hebrew poetry is created by the parallel lines rather than rhyming last words at the end. Wordsworth says poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings collected in tranquility. It's spontaneous. It's intuitive. And poetry, John Milton said, is simple, sensuous, and passionate. And Samuel Coleridge says, prose are words in their best order, while poetry is the best words in the best order. Molly Peacock said, the art that offers depth in a moment. And W.H. Arden said, poetry is memorable speech. Poetry too is about rhythm, and poetry too is about the form, the way the poetry is laid out. So in this brief introduction to poetry, we've looked at some examples of students, we've looked at an example of Psalm 23, and we've thought a bit about what is it that poetry makes it so powerful. And therapeutically, if you go in to see someone in a hospital, you can make a statement, you know, you're not looking well, your skin is white, or you can share a psalm. I've been encouraged by Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd. Can I share that with you? So poetry is powerful. When you're feeling down, read a psalm like Psalm 23. Write a psalm or a poem when you're feeling down. It's helpful because it touches the deep innermost recesses. So after this short break, we'll come back and we'll have a look at poetry in the Psalms in greater detail. And we'll look at the way poetry in the Psalms works as literature. And also we can look therapeutically at the way poetry in the Psalms